Let's upgrade your 3D printer's boring control screen with KlipperScreen. BigTreeTech sent me this really cool Raspberry Pad 5-inch LCD screen, and I'm going to use this as a replacement for my traditional screen. This thing has some really cool features. The big one being here we've got a spot to put a Raspberry Pi CM4, a compute module. On top of that, there's a place for a real-time battery. We've got the SD card slot. If we take a look here at the bottom, we've got the USB port, HDMI port, the traditional ribbon cable connectors, as well as a USB-C port with a switch, so it can be used for both canbus as well as USB. On this side, we've got the Ethernet port. Over here, where normally there'd be Raspberry Pi set of I/O pins, we've got sockets and then the controls for the LCD screen. Got the two USB ports and the micro SD card slot. The Pad 5 comes with the USB-C cable that you'll need to program it, set it up, and connect it. On top of it, it comes with all the bolts you need, plus an additional set of about 4 extra, and these standoffs. I ordered the Pad 5 with this compute module, so it came all in one package. I've never used one of these or seen one of these CM4s before, these embeddable Raspberry Pis, but I just was not prepared for the size of this thing. This is way smaller than I ever expected. Just when I see them in photos, I don't quite notice the scale of this thing. And this is really quite cool because it's got the normal traditional CPU. It's got 2 gigs of RAM. It's got Wi-Fi. And here we have the 2 connectors that are used to mount it. And I actually went for a version with emmc storage stored onto it, so it doesn't use an SD card. To mount the CM4, take off the protective coverings of the bolt holes, and then you simply take the Pad 5 and mount it on top. It only mounts in one way if you look really careful. The sockets are just a little bit offset. Give it a little push, a gentle push, again, making sure it's aligned. And once it's looking pretty good, bolt it down with the 4 included screws. Tighten them in a cross pattern just to make sure it's even pressure. And that should be it. If you're using the standard SD card reader, you can actually skip this next step, but because I'm using the emmc on the card, on the Pi, I've got to move this switch all the way to the left and remove the protective plastic covering from the dip switches here. And we got to set a setting, 2 switches, so we can actually put this into a mode where when I plug it into my PC, it appears as if I plugged in an SD card. Here you can see the dip switch with the plastic removed, and using a device gently move these 2 switches over. And we are now in mode where I can plug this in and this appears as a disk to my PC. So here I'm plugging in the USB cable that came with the Raspberry Pad 5, and then I'm going to plug this into a USB 3 port on my PC. The instructions recommend that you use a powered USB hub, and if you have one, use it because it can provide enough power to power this. I don't have one, and so I chose to plug it into USB 3 because theoretically that version of USB can support more power. Make sure you unplug every other USB 3 device from your PC to make sure there's enough current to run this. Trust me, if you don't, this isn't going to work. In addition, to get your eMMC memory to appear, or your Pi to appear, here's some instructions on the Raspberry Pi website for the Compute Module 4. And this teaches you or explains to you how to set up the bootloader. And there's options here for Windows, for Mac, in my case, Linux. And so I actually had to build this, and we'll do that now. So I'm simply copying from the documentation of the Pi library, and I'll give you the link to that in the description above. But here I'm installing a USB library that's needed to make sure the bootloader can be set up and configured. And so it's installed, or at least that's what just happened right here. And then the next step is another copy here. I'm cloning the code from Raspberry Pi, and this is the USB boot code. And then the next step, change into this USB directory, and then run make. Once that's complete, change into the USB boot directory, and then we run sudo /rpi boot, which runs the software we just built using make, that then writes to the Pad 5 CM4 Pi. And this is going to allow us to see it on the desktop. For these next steps, I'm simply following the Raspberry Pi Pad 5 manual from BigTreeTech. I've posted a link in the comments above. You need to choose an OS image unless you're just going to simply reuse your previous boot SD card. I'm not. And so, especially because I'm using emmc, I can't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the Raspberry Pi Lite image. You can choose the others if you're more comfortable with those, but they do use a lot of memory, and there's really no need for any of that. In addition, make sure you download and install the Raspberry Pi Imager if you haven't done that already. And then if you're going to boot from an SD card, simply follow these steps. But again, you really only have to do this if you're not going to reuse a previously installed card that was running Klipper on the Pi. Since I'm not using an SD card, you do need to scroll down a little bit here, and here's the instructions for the eMMC version. Here's where it tells you to set the settings and what you need to download in terms of a file. And we already just set the switch settings properly a few moments ago, and so now we'll step through the rest of this. Here the Raspberry Pi Imager is running. If you're going to run Mainsail, you need to select the option, and so scroll down to Other Specific OS 3D Printing and select Mainsail OS. And once you do, this will be the image. If you're going to run Fluid like I am, and I've posted a link to this up in the description above, you'll have to go to the Fluid Pi GitHub and download the latest version of Fluid Pi. And again, I'll post this link for you. And once you do, you need to unzip this file. It'll create a directory, and then we'll go back to the Raspberry Pi Imager to select this as an image, and I'll show you how to do that. So once you download the file, you'll need to go in and unzip it. And here you can see the Fluid Pi RPI Lite version 19 image. In my case, I'm using Linux, so I'm just going to extract here, but you can use pkunzip or any other tool you've got. And once that unzips, it should create a folder. And within that folder, you'll have the image file that we're going to be selecting with the Raspberry Pi Imager. So here I'm back in the Pi Imager, and for the operating, I choose OS, and then scroll all the way down to the bottom of the list where it says Use Custom, and then select the Fluid Raspberry Pi OS Lite latest image file. Select Storage, and you should see the Raspberry Pi that you can select. Set your host name. Enable SSH and make sure you set your username and password so you can use SSH to connect to the Pad Pi 5. Go through, if you're going to set up wireless or anything like that, go ahead and do that. And then once you're done, hit save. With all of that configured, hit write to start writing the image to the Pi. It'll ask you or let you know that everything's going to be erased. That's fine. You want to do that. And then it will start to write. And this is going to take a little while. So I'm speeding up this video so we can get through this quickly. When it's complete, it'll ask you to disconnect either the SD card from the reader or in this case, the Pi from the PC. Once that's complete, unplug the Pad 5 and set these dip switches, micro switches back to the original positions all the way to the right. And that way we are no longer using it in boot mode and no longer using the USB-C port for USB. The most important lesson of this install: on a Raspberry Pi Compute Module 4, CM4, if you use the USB-C port as USB, it disables all the other USB ports. So either use it for canbus or don't use it at all. So now that we're done, you'll want to plug it into power through the USB-C port and connect it to an Ethernet port. And we have to finish some initial configuration here to get it to fully work. You probably noticed the screen isn't working. Well, there's other things that aren't too. So one of the first things we'll have to do is go in here and set up the USB 2 hub. So all the USB ports are active. We'll also need to go in and turn on the screen. And then if you want to use the real-time clock, we'll have to do that as well, in addition to inserting a battery. So simply following the directions in the BigTreeTech manual, which again, I have a link to, you'll want to SSH to the Pi. And once you SSH to the Pi, we want to edit the config.txt file, which is going to enable USB hub support, which means all the USB ports will be functional. I simply scroll down to the bottom and there's an all section here. You could use some of the other all sections as well. And I copied the text exactly as it existed within the BigTreeTech Raspberry Pad 5 manual, stated directly under how you enable USB support. And so I did that. And then you can do a write out and then an exit. And then again, to turn on the screen, copying and pasting from the BigTreeTech manual for the Pad 5. This is the install that will enable the screen so the Pi can start updating and writing to the screen as you would normally expect. And this will be quite critical. And then do a sudo reboot to reboot the Pi. It'll disconnect. You'll have to reconnect. But if you go down and take a look at your Pi, once it's rebooted, you should see everything you expect. And here I've just touched the middle button to flip the screen around. And as you can see, the Pi booted up. We've got a full-fledged screen here. Just for kicks, I'm plugging in a USB wireless keyboard here. And as you can see, I've got a fully fledged running computer here, running Linux, and this actually has Fluid and everything else installed, ready to go. And once you log in, you can actually run apps, and just for kicks, I'm here getting a directory listing. I'm sitting in the Klipper directory, and then I'm also going to run htop to see the system load here, just for kicks. Of course, the touch screen does not work at this point. There's no software installed to take advantage of that, but we'll take care of that in a minute because KlipperScreen will do that for us. If you're simply reusing your old SD card with all the existing data on it, you should be able to skip this part. But I started from scratch, and so one of the first things you need to do is copy your CFG files from your previous installation, so then we can upload this to the new version of the Pi, especially if you have the emmc and again started from scratch like I did. And so make sure you go down, select all your CFG files. Both Fluid and Mainsail have the option where you can select to download these files, and make sure you get all the CFG files or it's going to be a little difficult. Depending on the printer you're going to be connecting this to, you need to work out how to mount the screen. BigTreeTech has a beautifully designed casing that you can use. However, I could not. So I remixed a screen mount for the BigTreeTech Pad 5 that I found on printables. And this is actually the first incarnation of it. The second incarnation, I actually redesigned it so I can flip the screen around. For my Voron 2.4, this is, at least for now, what worked best for me. It's a sturdy, solid mount. I've placed a link to this as well as the BigTreeTech version as well in the description of this video. There are other options as well if you're using Creality, Prusa, or any of the others. In addition, you'll need to think about how you're going to connect this. And so in my case, I initially assumed I was going to be using the USB-C port as one of the ports. Uh, don't do that for USB. I also purchased a right angle USB connector to make it look a little neater as I plugged it on the outside. And I also purchased a right angle Ethernet port connector or extender as well. If you're going to be connecting the Pad 5 directly to your MCU through one of the standard MCU ports and then power it through the USB-C port, you'll be fine. If not, you're going to have to build one of these little connectors, DuPont connectors. It's a male connector. It's real simple, just positive and negative, and we'll connect it to power using this later. So let's physically install it. First thing you need to do, remove the old screen. This is mine. Again, this is a Voron 2.4. Depending on the printer you're using, I'm sure it'll probably be different. It's pretty simple. You usually just have to unscrew it at the mount and then disconnect the two ribbon cables, assuming you're using a screen like this. Your printer may use a single one. Either case, it's connected to the MCU and you no longer need it. If you're upgrading an existing 3D printer that has a Raspberry Pi installed, in this case you see mine with a canbus hat, you'll have to remove it. You don't need it anymore because we've got a new Pi to replace it. So go ahead and mount the Pad 5 in your preferred location. And this is exactly in the spot that my old screen took. And it simply takes 2 bolts against the extrusion here with the inserted T-nuts. And it's quite stable, or at least this mount seems to be. I suspect in the future I might make a couple changes to it. If any of you have a Voron 2.4 and you've got a nicer mount for this, or you found one, please let me know where it's at because, well, I'm not so great at designing these things. Then go ahead and plug a USB cable into one of the USB ports of your choice. And then go ahead and plug the other end of that into the USB port of your MCU. And if you don't use CAN bus or anything like that, and this is the way you normally connect your MCU to a Pi, you are done with the physical connections here, and you can skip the next section, which is going to be for our CAN bus users only. So you've got CAN bus, and like always, we've got some extra steps here. In my case, I had a CAN bus connector on my Pi. It really didn't fit in the case that I had connected to the front of my Voron. So I needed to replace this, and I chose to replace it with the U2C from BigTreeTech, which is a canbus transceiver that I think many of you are aware of and probably many of you already have. I simply used a USB-C connector cable that I plugged into the U2C, and on the other end, of course, plugged into the Pad 5's USB-C connector. And you need to make sure that switch there is set in the opposite direction to the right, so it's in CAN bus mode. So then we go ahead and make our connection to Ethernet. And in addition to Ethernet, we're going to go ahead and make our power connection as well. We use the connector that we made earlier. Make sure you skip the very first hole. Make sure the positive lead comes first and then the negative lead right after. It's critically important that you get those right. And the other end of this, of course, connects to your DC power supply, 5-volt power supply, and make sure it's only 5 volts so you don't blow your Pi. And after that, I'm just going to go ahead, attach the cover, and the other USB connector I have here is actually for the camera, which I'm connecting as well. And now that the cover is on, I can actually connect the other end of my right angle Ethernet connector here as well. If you're using wireless, by all means, use that instead. I don't. I've got trust issues with wireless when it comes to my printer, so I always use Ethernet cable. So you'll want to double check all your wiring and turn on your computer, and then SSH into the Pi. And you'll want to do a sudo apt update to check and see if there are any upgrades, and there most likely will be. And then you'll want to do a sudo apt upgrade. And it'll ask you, do you want to do this? It's going to take quite a bit of space. Say yes. And then you can probably walk away for the next 10 minutes because this is probably going to take a while. And so let it just run to completion and it'll completely update the operating system and everything else on your Pi to be the absolute latest. So now head over to the IP address of your Pi using your web browser. Or use the domain name that you entered in previously. And if you get this error message that you see here, this most likely means that you installed from scratch and therefore Mainsail or Fluid don't have, and Klipper don't have the CFG files that are needed. So as I showed you earlier, I saved those. There is an option here to simply upload the file. I tried it, it wasn't working for me. So my workaround was to create a new file, give it the name of the CFG file that I was intending to have here, and then it allowed me to copy and paste the body of the CFG file that I had into this and then allowed me to save it. And so I simply went through and did it to all the CFG files that I had, and that should eliminate the error message for you. Another issue you may face is you will find this virtual SD card error quite possibly when you connect either to Mainsail or to Fluid initially. So copy the text down here, these 2 lines, exactly like it says, and then go into your printer.cfg file and somewhere in there, I don't think it's critical, paste those lines in. In this case, I'm simply selecting this area because I think it'll look better there. And that's about it. So paste it, save it, and then you will most likely need to reboot Klipper and the firmware. And once you do, the error message should disappear and you should be good to go. For those of you using CAN bus, just a note, if you're starting from scratch and using CAN bus and trying to connect the screen, you should really just jump off to uh, any of the canbus documentation that exists out there. I have a link. I've also included a link to a previous video that covers really how you deal with the rest of canbus. So I'm going to assume from here on out, you know what you're doing and you don't need anything else. And that way we can skip on to the next most important part, which is ClipperScreen itself. So now the part you've all been waiting for. Finally, we get to install ClipperScreen. And I apologize for some of you because you may think about the fact that maybe if everything was running as is, you already had everything installed, you could do this. But anyway, let's change into the directory and then let's clone the GitHub of ClipperScreen. And then let's go ahead and run the script that's the installer. Whoops. First have to change into the directory and then run the ClipperScreen installer. I'm going to post the link to these instructions into the description of this video as well. It simply shows you where I copied and pasted from. And this is speeded up many, many times, like 1,000% faster than any Pi could actually run this. You should probably go off and get a cup of coffee while this is running. And once you get back, once that's completed, there's one more thing you'll want to do. You'll want to go into Mainsail or in Fluid, and you want to go and edit your moonraker.conf file. And at the very bottom, we're going to paste the text that ClipperScreen recommends is part of Moonraker. And what will happen is this will make sure Moonraker checks for newer versions of ClipperScreen every time on a regular basis and update it automatically if needed. There isn't even a need to reboot. It automatically starts up, and when you go take a look at your printer, when you look at your Pad Pi 5 screen, you should see ClipperScreen. And every setting, all your configurations, everything you've got to do that's already set up in Klipper is what you see here.